Where does a king's authority originate? From God or from the will of the people? We shall see something of how Englishmen, in the first half of the 17th century, answered this question about the nature of royal authority. In 1603, the crown of England was accepted by James Stuart, King of Scotland, as heir to the Tudor monarchs. Traveling to London to become king, James passed through his new kingdom, where he surely must have seen evidences of the heritage of the Tudors. He saw with pleasure the splendid homes of the English aristocracy, homes that indicated the wealth of England. Peace and prosperity seemed reflected in farms and flocks and quiet villages. Homes like this were owned by the lesser gentry. They formed an important governing class that ran the local government smoothly and dominated Parliament. They had helped build a thriving nation for Tudor monarchs, including Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth's successor, James, would inherit too the strong, wealthy organization of the Church of England, and he was counting on it to control the worship of his subjects. James did not approve of the illegal meetings of the Puritans and others who preferred their own kind of worship. Yet the flame of religious conflict, fed by zealous Puritan preachers, was still another part of the Tudor heritage. But to James, the most significant heritage of the Tudors awaited him at Westminster Abbey. The crown of England. To him it was a symbol of absolute power, given him by God. Once enthroned, James considered himself in a position of absolute power over all his subjects. The king commanded. His people obeyed. We call this theory of government absolutism. James said, "Kings have the power of raising and casting down, life and death. They are judges over all their subjects, and yet accountable to none but God only." Thus James pictured himself as the ruler divinely appointed from heaven. But many of his subjects did not agree with this concept of divine right. Englishmen searched the Magna Carta and other medieval records to show that earlier kings had depended upon the assent of their people for their authority. Englishmen had come to feel that the will of the people had a place in government. They saw the king's authority balanced by the will of the people as expressed through Parliament. Yet supporters of the king, such as Francis Bacon, his Lord Chancellor, argued that absolutism was the most efficient government. Indeed, European politics seemed to prove it. Absolutism in Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire had created powerful states. At a conference here at Hampton Court in 1604, James extended his theory of absolutism to religion. To a group of Puritans asking for tolerance for their form of worship, James made clear there would be no changes in the Church of England form of worship. In applying his theory of absolutism to religion, as well as to politics, James raised once more the vital question that would soon split all England. Did the royal authority originate from God or from the will of the people? James' son and successor, Charles I, faced the same question. When Charles came to the throne in 1625, he too thought of himself as an absolute monarch. But he was unable to make absolutism work. The splendid nobles he surrounded himself with were of little help in his government. His trusted advisor, the Duke of Buckingham, brought Charles' finances close to ruin. In trying to raise money, Charles committed certain unpopular acts. He sent his officers to demand loans from wealthy subjects. Some who refused these loans were arrested by royal command. Unable to pay his soldiers, the king had them quartered in private homes. These were high-handed methods that angered his people. So when at last Charles had to ask Parliament for money, they countered his request with a petition of right designed to limit the king's authority. Among the provisions of the petition of right were these: the king must not get loans or taxes without Parliament's consent, must not arrest or punish a subject without legal process, must not quarter troops on his subjects. Would King Charles accept the petition? It was a momentous decision. And Charles did accept, for he needed the money urgently. It was a defeat for absolutism, for it helped to define the rights of Parliament. But Charles was still king. He dismissed Parliament. Charles would prove a king could rule alone, ignoring the will of Parliament. He would prove that absolutism could work. And for 11 years, without parliaments, King Charles did rule a peaceful England. Then this peace was shattered. A Scottish army invaded England. To meet it, King Charles was forced to raise an army he could not pay. Once again, he found he needed Parliament for money. This time, members of Parliament were openly hostile, unwilling to support the king. Convinced that he must make a show of strength, Charles and some armed supporters attempted to arrest parliamentary leaders, a bold action that helped precipitate war, a civil war between the king and his Parliament. People split into two groups. Royalists, the king's supporters, were called Cavaliers. Parliamentary supporters were called Roundheads. Throughout the country, men prepared to fight. Cavaliers took up arms to defend their king. Puritans, the most determined group of the Roundheads, took Bible and sword into the camps of their army. Armies were raised on both sides. For 6 long years, the Civil War was fought. Most of England remained loyal to the Royalist cause. But the forces of Parliament gradually rallied. At the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, and again at Naseby in 1645, Royalists were badly defeated. Parliament had triumphed. Out of the Civil War, 2 Puritan generals, Ireton and Cromwell, emerged as leaders of the parliamentary forces. They had made Parliament the supreme authority by force of arms. In 1648, a Parliament dominated by Puritans showed its new authority. It tried King Charles for treason. Found guilty, King Charles was led to his execution in January 1649. It seemed that this was the end of absolutism. But many Royalists still opposed the Commonwealth, as the government was now called. They still felt that supreme power should be in the hands of a monarch. Actually, supreme power was shifting to Oliver Cromwell, who dominated Parliament. In 1653, Cromwell felt it necessary to dismiss Parliament, which had failed to provide a stable government. Reluctantly, he accepted sole personal authority over the Commonwealth as Lord Protector. England was now a Puritan state, where discipline on manners and morals was imposed by Cromwell, and he did this in the name of God, as James and Charles had done before him. In this absolute rule of 7 years, many Englishmen were asking whether Cromwell, as Lord Protector, was thwarting the will of the people. Wasn't this absolutism all over again? When Cromwell died in 1658, the Commonwealth could not be held together. In 1660, A parliamentary general, George Monk, was expressing the hopes of many Englishmen when he sent to Holland to invite Charles II, son of Charles I, to accept the English throne. So Charles II was restored to the throne. But he was not restored as an absolute monarch. He was to understand that a king was the servant of his people. The will of the people would be expressed through their parliament to the king. He owed his authority not to God, but to Parliament. It was an idea that would help sustain the British monarchy in the future. The concept that the power reposing in the king originates in the will of his subjects.